All right, hello and welcome everyone. So today we're going to talk about experimental research methods and particularly the two-factor design or two-group design. So we'll start with just some really broad definitions. Um, Throughout the course, we'll talk about experimental and non-experimental research. The key difference is that non-experimental research, which we'll cover later, is designed to determine what is happening. So think of it as non-experimental is describing the picture. Experimental research is determining why something is happening. So it's not a snapshot the way non-experimental research is, that's just describing what's happening. Experimental is intentionally manipulating things to determine why something is happening or what the outcome is. So most of what we talk so far in the class is experimental research. Again, experimental research is a systematic and scientific approach where we are manipulating one or more variables as the researcher so that we can test to see the differences based on that manipulation. It is extremely important for causation, but I'm going to go on about that in a second. So these concepts should be familiar, but just to recap, the major concepts in experimental research are our independent variable, and this is the variable or variables, but usually one that is being manipulated by the researcher. The reason you usually only want to have one independent variable, if possible, is because it's hard to know why something changes if multiple variables are changing at once. So I like to cook and let's think of it as like a recipe. If I'm making soup and I've made this same recipe 100 times the exact same way and I get the exact same outcome every time. If one day I change 3 ingredients in the soup and I get a different outcome, I won't know which of those ingredients is actually making the difference in the outcome of the soup, which is why you want to test things one thing at a time. That's our independent variable. Our dependent variable is the outcome variable or the thing we're measuring. So in my example, it would be the taste of the soup would be the dependent variable. We literally remember them as the dependent variable depends on what I do in the research. So independent and then dependent. Our extraneous variables are variables other than our independent and dependent that could influence results. So going back to my soup, example here, an extraneous variable might be something like my dog barking the entire time that I am making soup. If my dog is barking the entire time and I am agitated and I am emotionally frustrated, I might chop things less evenly. Or, I mean, that's a good example of an extraneous variable too in my soup is how small or how precise each of the ingredients are, my cut techniques. There's lots of different things that can impact our dependent variable, and we try to control for them as many as possible so that we can really clearly identify what it is that's changed that has an impact on the outcome. We're trying to avoid confounding variables. Confounding variables are a specific type of extraneous variables that have influence on that dependent variable. So an extraneous variable varies systematically with the independent variable. So again, just to recap that, extraneous variable is something that your research isn't accounting for, but could influence results. Confounding variables are a specific type of extraneous variables that are going to confuse the results, or confound, if you will, the results. So some major components of experimental research is this is kind of recapping what I just said, but we're manipulating an independent variable because we want to observe what happens. We are measuring that dependent variable, so it's really important to have a very strong conceptualization and operationalization of that dependent variable so we can see the change. And part of experimental research is designing in a way that we are controlling for extraneous variables. This is especially, and I mean especially important in any sort of behavioral sciences or psychological research because goodness knows we are all totally different. We have totally different life experiences. And we'll never be able to control for all extraneous variables, but it's very important that we are intentional in the research design to try to mitigate or lessen the impact of them as much as possible. I'm not going to watch this video, but I do like it, especially as you recap things. I recommend Sometimes it's helpful just to hear something a couple of different ways. Okay. So the benefits of experimental research, the big thing is that the only way to prove cause and effect is through experimental research. The only way we know for sure that the independent variable is the thing that is changing the dependent variable is to keep everything else as similar as possible and only change that one variable. So we can say X causes Y. We can say this change or this variable, depending on all of its variations, impacts our outcome in a particular way. So causality. This is a really unique feature of experimental research. All other types can't prove cause and effect. They can only prove what is. They can describe a scenario, but you can't actually say one thing results in the other. I will harp on this in much greater detail when we talk about correlational research a little bit later in the semester, but the crux of it is that correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things are happening at the same time or co-occurring does not mean that one causes the other. The classic example of this is that ice cream sales go up at the same time that shark attacks do. Think about that. There's more shark attacks in the summer, and there's higher ice cream sales in the summer. But if I'm just looking at correlation, someone who doesn't understand statistics might mistakenly believe that the ice cream sales have something to do with the shark attacks. But actually, there's this other confounding variable that is the weather and the time of year. There are more people at the beach, there are more people in the ocean and near sharks, so there's a higher likelihood they're going to get bit by sharks. And at the same time, it's hotter, people are outside, people are more likely to get ice cream. So it's not that correlation, just because two things are happening at the same time, does not mean they are causing each other. I'm going to go on about this much later, so I'll stop myself. But experimental research is causal. So in order for an experimental research design to be able to claim causality, saying this happens because of that, it has to meet three core criteria. The first one is covariation. So this is where we are proving the statistical relatedness between our independent and dependent variables. Another way of saying this is we are showing statistically that these things are related in a meaningful way. I'm going to go on about this a lot more when I talk about stats and how to interpret them, but the short of it is that this covariation or association is the causality. We're saying when one thing changes, this is the outcome. We also have to have a temporal precedence, which means the cause has to happen before the effect. The independent variable has to occur before the dependent variable. And I know that, sounds kind of hypothetical. And well, duh, Mel, of course things have to happen first before the outcome. Yes, but that's actually really easy to confuse in research design. So an example here is a study measuring stress levels after participants complete a mindfulness training. What inexperienced researchers might do is they might level or measure stress levels and ask, have you ever been to therapy? But they don't ask about stress levels if you're currently in therapy versus previously in therapy versus want to go to therapy in the future. That temporal component of it, you have to be able to prove that one thing changing results in a different outcome. And three is the elimination of alternative explanations or internal validity. We've talked about internal validity. I'll try not to repeat myself too horribly much. And honestly, elimination is a strong word. We are trying to lessen all the possible extraneous and confounding variables. We are trying to keep the relationship between the IV and DV as tight as possible, as few extraneous variables as possible, as few compounds as possible. Again, that is extremely difficult to do with humans, so design is very important. I'll talk about some of those design considerations in a second. All right, we also have some new concepts here. So there are two major types of variables that are not just independent and dependent. There are also things called mediator and moderator variables. A mediator variable explains the process through which the independent variable influences the dependent variable. So it helps understand the underlying why or how that they're connected, that mechanism or pathway. So an example here is a study might find that a new teaching method, that independent variable, it's a new thing we're testing, this certain teaching method, improves student performance, our dependent variable. And that increased engagement is the mechanism through which that happens. So it's not magically, oh, someone teaches differently and boom, the performance changes. Actually, it's that engagement is increased with this new teaching technique, and that mediates the relationship from the teaching technique to the performance. Getting a little fancier now, right? And that's a crucial difference between a moderator. A moderator is also a third variable, but it affects the strength or direction of the relationship between the IV and the DV. So it specifies under what conditions the independent variable strengthens or weakens the dependent variable. An example here is a study examining the effect of a training program, so our independent variable, on employee productivity, dependent variable, finds that employee motivation is a moderator and influences the effectiveness of the training. Another way of saying that is that how much the employee cares to learn in a training program is a very important piece of information in between our IV and DV. It's not just the training program. There's also this really critical part that will predict the strength of that relationship. I'm making an educated guess here, but I would guess that employee motivation is probably positively predictive of how effective this training program is. Another way to say that is the more someone is motivated to learn, the more I would expect that training program to help increase productivity. Whereas if they were less motivated, I would expect that the training program would have less of an effect on that productivity. So the difference again is mediator is the process of influence and moderator is the strength and direction of relationship. It's really confusing, I know, and really critical components of experimental research, definitely. Another very big part of this, like the core of experimental research and behavioral science, or really in general, are participant groups. So we're going to start with really the most basic type of experimental research, which is called a two-group design. This is where participants are very literally put into two groups. One is the experimental group. This is the group of participants that has something manipulated. So they get the treatment or they get some sort of variant. So in our examples here, if we were doing an experimental group, half of the participants would get the training and half of the participants would not get the training. And we would test on both sides how their motivation to work and I forget what our outcome was already. Productivity, sorry. So we would test how that impacts productivity. The experimental group, quite literally, are the group that gets the experiment. They have this new or different independent variable. The control group, on the other hand, does not receive the intervention or manipulation. So there's lots of different options I'll go over in a second and what we might do with a control group. I'll back it up and say another way to say this is that the control group is like your base normal. Without the experimental messing with anything, here's what we know about the relationship between the DV and the IV. Experimental, we can say, okay, we have manipulated the IV, and here's how the relationship is different once we do that. It's literally a comparison group. It's really all that it is. But as you might imagine, it gets a whole lot more complicated than that. The treatment condition or group is the group that a participant is assigned to, where we're deciding if they're getting that IV manipulated or not. There are a lot of different ways to do this. Again, the core is that our control group or control conditions is sort of like the benchmark that we're comparing the other forms against. And then we have a lot of different options for this. So one is called a no treatment control. This is a group that receives absolutely no intervention. So we don't mess with them at all. We keep it as natural as possible to whatever that particular research design is. A placebo control is when participants receive a placebo or a sham intervention that they believe to be real, and we're controlling for psychological effects while receiving the treatment. I'm going to give an example of all these in a second, so hold with me. The waitlist control group is when participants are placed on a waiting list and they are at first in that control group not receiving the independent variable manipulation, and then after the experiment, then they get that exposure. And sometimes it's not ethical or practical to have a control group, and so we try to find a best available alternative. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, let's give an example. So one of the easiest ways to talk about this is probably going to be through medication. So let's say that we are a researcher that is testing a new antidepressant medicine, and I want to see how effective that antidepressant medicine is. In a two-group experimental design, I might have one group who has, and this is our control group, who I do not give the antidepressant to. I give them no treatment. I don't do anything differently to them. I have them come in once and I test their depression. I wait 6 months. I test their depression again. I've done nothing. I've not manipulated anything. No treatment. With my experimental group, that in the same experiment, I would bring them in. I would give them that medication for 6 months, and then I would test pre-post for depression. So that way I can say, okay, the group of people who didn't get any treatment, this is like the base, and then the group of people who did get a treatment, here's how that's different. And the only thing that's different is the medication. Oh, causality. The placebo control group is really interesting because sometimes our expectations, our psychological expectations, very literally change our outcomes or perceptions of the world. So picking on the depression medication again, instead of a no treatment group, I could instead give one group the real medication, and I could give one group a sugar pill. I tell them that this is the antidepressant. They take it every day for 6 months, and I test their depression on pre-post. Part of why we like placebo control groups, especially in psychology and behavioral science research, is because we know psychologically your expectation can very strongly predict our outcomes. So it's kind of wild, actually. It's a really big issue with psychiatric medicine because a lot of time people have a placebo effect. The belief that they are getting antidepressant medicine every day can actually significantly decrease their depressive experiences. So even though they're in the placebo group, we can still see meaningful statistical change depending on our question and what we're doing in that particular experiment. Sometimes they're needed, sometimes they're not. Usually, if there is some sort of risk of mental expectation changing the outcome of something, then a placebo group is a good idea when it's feasible. We also have the waitlist control. So moving on again with that depression medicine, let's say we have a no treatment control group where I don't give one group anything and the other group gets the depression medicine. We find out it works pretty well. Well, the placebo group are like, hey, or not placebo, I'm sorry, the no treatment group are gonna be like, hey, what in the world? I joined this research to try this medicine and I didn't even get the medicine. So the waitlist group, after we test between our two group design of no medication and medication, after that, we would then give them medication, and usually we would then bring in a new group of people to serve as the base, and we do that several iterations, so we get lots of data. And that way, everyone who participates will still actually get the treatment. This is especially important in any sort of medical research. So imagine being like a cancer patient and signing up for some experimental drug that might save your life, but you get assigned to a placebo control group. You get injected with something that's actually water every day and you see no outcome. Or you might have a placebo effect and you see a little bit of an outcome. But they find out the medication is actually working really well. I would be extremely agitated, to say the least, if I was that participant who did not get the treatment that I signed up for testing. So instead, they'll usually give that treatment after the original two-group design. Sometimes there's more groups. We'll talk about that later. All right. Okay, so control groups, conditions. We've already covered internal validity and external validity. I just reminded us all here what those are. So internal validity is the degree to which an experiment demonstrates the causal relationship between IV and DV. External is how generalizable those findings are to other people. So part of how we make studies more generalizable or their results more generalizable to larger groups of people is through a process called random assignment. This is where we assure that every participant in the research has an equal chance of being assigned to any particular group. So this is extremely important for any sort of between subject design, between group designs. Right now we're talking about two group, it will get more complicated, hold on. But random assignment means that the researchers are not inflicting their own bias on who gets what condition. This can be really impactful in medical research, something like cancer research, like I was talking about a second ago. We don't want the person who's, whatever researcher is consenting people into the study, they don't just look at the person and decide you get treatment or you don't. That's way too much power. That's way too much bias based on how much you like the person, based on how much you're sympathetic towards the person, based on how much you think the person deserves it, whatever that is, whatever that human research bias is, we want to avoid for that. So instead, what we'll do is randomly assign people. Usually this means that we consent everyone into the study, we assign them all a number, and then we use some sort of random number identifier to identify half of them to go into one group and the other half to go into the other. There's lots of different ways to do random assignment, but at its core, that's what it is. It's when the researcher themselves aren't placing people into groups. That being said, sometimes it's important that your groups are similar on other variables. Sometimes people will use a matched pair design, which is a technique where for every two participants or even numbers, depending on how many groups, but we're talking about two groups that have really similar traits, we'll make sure they're not assigned to the same group. So an example of something like this is if I was working with the cancer example again, and we had two participants and both of them had already been through a certain chemo before, I wouldn't want to put both of them in the same group. I would want them to be in opposite groups. So you can do both. You can have match pair design that is randomly assigned. It's a little more complicated. Basically, what I would do is I would collect all the information I need from participants and the consent process, and then I would randomly within each of those variables of interest, use a statistical software to make sure that my groups are still even and random, but the match pair is fairly distributed so that those other key variables are distributed between groups in a relatively equal way. So I know that gets complicated. The core of it is that the more random it is, the more valid it is. And depending on your research topic, you might also need to think about match pair. Another really, really strong approach when possible is called blinding. So this is a practice of concealing certain information from participants or researchers or both to lessen the chance of bias or sway in analytical results. So we are trying by the blinding process to assure that the behaviors, attitude, responses, both of participants and researchers are as unbiased as possible. We're trying to like take the human element out of it. The most simple way to do this is called participant blinding, which we call single blind method. And this is when the participants don't know if they're in the control group or the experimental group. Most of the time, if something is a placebo group, they actually if they're in a placebo group, it's blinded. They don't know that they're in a placebo group. That would defeat the entire purpose, right? Double blinding, which is also called investigator blinding, is when both participants and researchers don't know the group assignment. So if I'm going back to my antidepressant example, or even the cancer example, not only would the participants not know what group they're in, but the person actually delivering the intervention also wouldn't know. So if I was participating in that depression medicine research and I was giving medication to participants, I literally would not know if it was sugar or if it was the real thing. And part of why the double blind is so powerful is because it reduces the ability for researchers or participants to have expectations. And this is especially important in any sort of behavioral health research. And then we have this last one, which is called data analysis blinding or triple blinding. And this is when not only participants and not only researchers, but also the researchers analyzing the data don't know the group assignments. Sometimes this makes sense for the question, sometimes it doesn't. This is, again, trying to eliminate bias and make sure that we have the most objective results possible. It's not always possible. Sometimes the analytic people have to know who's in what group if we're comparing between groups. And sometimes you don't. It just depends on the research question. So blinding, single, double, and triple, all options, all to help increase those validities. A very big part of validity is also participant sampling. Really, really important. Who the sample is really, really matters. We want to make sure that participants are getting the same treatment wherever possible. And we also want to make sure that key variables or key demographics usually of participants are evenly distributed between groups. So lots of points here. Part of why we want to, wait, I think I might have messed these up. No, okay, I already talked about, yeah, okay, never mind. Sorry, just kidding. So part of what we want to do to help make sure that everyone is getting the same treatment within those who are having the treatment group or IV manipulated, so we want to make sure that it's all the exact same way. So consistent, we want to make sure participants are experiencing the same conditions and therefore minimizing the impact of extraneous variables. So an example of something like this, if I'm using the depression medicine example again, is making sure that all of the participants are taking the medication at the same time of day, because that really impacts efficacy of the treatment. If some of the participants are taking it in the morning on an empty stomach, and some of them are taking it midday, right after lunch, and some of them wait until right before they go to bed and they drink a glass of alcohol beforehand, those are biologically different and your body will respond differently. Those are extraneous variables. So we want to make sure that the treatment condition is as similar as possible. If you ever participate in any sort of research that is experimental, they will give you really, 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 really specific instructions. And depending on the research, they will either make sure that you come in and physically do that thing in front of them, or document it all and sign something saying that you're not lying. So very important, that detailed protocol of every single step in the experiment. We are trying to make sure there is as least variance as possible so that we can be really sure that our independent variable is the thing that's causing the outcome. We've already talked about that, blah, blah, blah. We talked about controlling for experimenter expectancies as well. So again, this is where we use these blinding procedures. Yeah, highest standard. Most of the time in experimental research, this means we're going to start with a pilot test. That means before we actually do the full experiment, we'll start with a much smaller group of people, and really we're trying to make sure the procedure doesn't have any wonky steps in it. It's a preliminary small scale study used to test and refine the research design. We want to make sure everything goes well. So whenever possible, you really want to do a pilot test before an experiment, because it just makes sure that things are going to go more smooth during the real experiment itself. So we test all of the specific methods and procedures, we find those issues, you train staff to make sure that researchers are not only deeply understanding the research design and nuance so that they can accurately behave, for lack of a better way to say that, we also want to make sure that everyone's doing everything the exact same way. So let's say as part of that depression example, I'm using that depressive medicine, if the staff members are supposed to be asking questions about depression to the participants. Let's say they come in once a week and they talk to a researcher about their levels of depression. It's important that the staff is asking the same questions in the same way. The difference between sending someone a electronic survey and asking them to answer questions verbally over the phone is actually a really considerable difference in terms of procedure, because there's more room for human bias when we talk to them over the phone. But at the same time, we talked about that in survey design, pros and cons of each. Let's see. Also, a really nice part of pilot testing is you see how much time and resources are actually needed. It's almost always more than you expect. Spoiler alert. And it also gives a really awesome opportunity for participants to give feedback. So not only are we testing to make sure the researchers are doing everything sound and research design is very methodical, we're also giving space for the participants to say, hey, here's why that's not practical. Hey, here's why this doesn't make sense. Hey, here's this thing that's coming up for me. Can we tweak it? This, that, and the other thing. We love pilot studies. It's usually done when you have funding, but alas. All right, so statistics. I know everyone is groaning from afar. Yep, that's fine. We're not going to get too deep into it today. We're just going to do a little recap. So as a recap, there are two main types of statistics. One is called descriptive statistics, and this is quite literally statistics that just describes your data. We're not talking about relationships between things. We're just talking about what is the data. So these are things like means, averages, standard deviations. These are also things like demographics are a descriptive. So if I say, what are your descriptive statistics of your sample? What I'm usually asking are things like, what is the age? What is the gender? What is the race, ethnicity? Whatever those key variables are that are important, descriptive statistics. Inferential statistics, on the other hand, let us draw conclusions between data. So we are testing the relationship between variables. You need both. And before you really start that, you have to do a couple things to make sure that your data is going to be usable. So researchers have to take certain steps to make sure that there's balance in between the groups, and we're testing for normalcy of that data. So first thing I do when I get all my data, it's all exciting, it's all these numbers. I'm going to check for the sample sizes of both groups. You need to make sure they're relatively the same, and you need to make sure your sample size is big enough to run the statistics that you want. It's not a statistics class, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but very first thing you do is you make sure everything looks right. Let's say I am doing that depression experiment with the depression medicine, and I look at my control group and I look at my depressive group, and I realize after the fact that the control group is all like 80% of them are under the age of 30, and my experimental group, 90% of them are over the age of 65. That matters. That imbalance between groups on something that we know is tied to the outcome, like age, is not good science. So we need to make sure that the groups relatively match each other on those key considerations of whatever your particular sample is. We also want to test for normalcy assumptions. So we want to make sure that actually, let me back that up. When you're determining what statistics to use, almost all statistics are determined on whether your data is normally distributed or not. If your data is normally distributed, that means you're allowed to use things like the Sherpa-Wilkin, different types of tests. And if they aren't, then you can't use those types. There are other statistics you'll have to use to control for the skew or lack of normalcy. Yeah, so there's two major ways to test for normalcy. Again, you have the statistical test, and you also have a visual inspection. I'm not going to go too deep into this. I'm just going to remind you what a normal bell curve looks like. Let's pretend that this is our chart, and 0 is all the way over here, and 0 means no depression scale or no depressive symptoms, and all the way over here, 10 means all the depressive symptoms. We want in our control group for people to have a pretty normal distribution. That means that most people, so our mean of the group should be the most common. Well, I mean, it is by design, but you want to make sure that they're not too skewed in any particular direction. You want a fairly even bell curve so that your statistics will run correctly. And if it's not an even bell curve, it just changes the statistics you're allowed to use. So here's what a normal distribution looks like. See that nice little bell curve? And then here's a skewed distribution where there's all these people down here, but not where you'd expect it to be in terms of average. So again, this isn't a stats class. We're not going to go too much deeper than that, but that's what I got for you today. We're going to start next week with what do you do after you have the data, all the fancy stats and whatnot. But the big takeaway is that there's two things you got to do. First, you got to make sure that the groups are balanced. And second, you got to test for normalcy to determine what statistics you're going to run. All right. So there we go. Introduction to experimental research. We just talked about the basic two-group design. It will get more complicated, so buckle in, but welcome to experimental research.